Siena, in the first half of the 16th century, was plagued with internal conflict, weakening the Republic and putting it under threat from the Spanish Emperor Charles V. And yet, from this turbulent time, we find the creation of a remarkable astronomical text, de la Stella Fisse, that historians refer to as the first celestial atlas. This text stands on the border between love and war, and in this video, we'll examine a copy printed in 1579 to understand how its author, Alessandro Piccolomini, recommended readers understand astronomy before the telescope. Before diving into the book, let's explore some background, beginning with its author, Alessandro Piccolomini. Piccolomini was born in 1508 to Angelo and Margherita Piccolomini, members of the aristocracy in Siena in modern-day Italy. I should note that at this time, Siena was an independent state. Alessandro was the eldest child but went into the church very early. His uncle, Giovanni Piccolomini, was a cardinal who granted Alessandro ecclesiastical benefices when he was only 9 years old. He was also promised to more important religious orders when he reached the age of 17, the minimum age required for admission to such orders. Alessandro received additional benefices from Pope Clement VII in February of 1523, along with promises that he could be nominated to the office of the archpriest of the Diocese of Siena, again when he reached the appropriate age. It is believed that he attended the University of Siena, but the records of enrollment from this period are mostly lost, so that suspicion cannot be confirmed. We do know that he moved to Padua in 1539, just after he turned 30, and there he had several renowned tutors, including Marco Antonio Passeri, Vincenzo Maggi, and Federico Delfino. Delfino in particular is important to our story, as he was the chair of math and astronomy at the University of Padua from 1520 to 1547. And evidently, Piccolomini held Delfino in high regard, as Piccolomini specifically wrote about having attended a demonstration of Delfino's to determine the length of a solar year. Piccolomini claims that this was sufficiently accurate to be able to discredit the values given in the Alphonsine tables, and which instead matched more closely to the value given by the Islamic astronomer al-Battani. Additionally, based on the works that Piccolomini recommends to those interested in astronomy, as well as those he references, we can get a feel for what works he must have been familiar with. Obviously, from the citation above, he must have been familiar with the Alphonsine tables from the 13th century, which were developed for astronomical calculations. Additionally, Piccolomini claimed that he, at one point, desired to write a defense of Ptolemy's Almagest against a criticism written by Jabir ibn Aflan from the 9th century, indicating that he was certainly familiar with both of those texts. Piccolomini recommends that those interested in the Almagest also explore a commentary written by Theon of Alexandria, as well as some more general books on mathematics, including specific books from Euclid's Elements and Regiomontanus's De Triangulus. Piccolomini also tells us that the tables in De la Stella Fisse were constructed using propositions from Peter Apian's Instrumentum Primi Mobilis, published in 1534. Piccolomini certainly had some training in what we would today call astrology, although he adopts the position that it is superstitious. Thus, we don't see many of the primary texts on astrology in his recommended reading list, but overall, this is quite a strong list of texts, and indicates that Piccolomini was quite well trained in the field. But aside from his formal training, historians focus on Piccolomini's participation in a literary and scholarly society known as the Accademia degli Intronati. Piccolomini joined this society sometime around 1528 to 1530, and for the standards of the day, this Accademia was extremely progressive in several ways. The first was that its scope extended beyond just the Latin and Greek classics. They also studied contemporaneous literature, mostly poetry and theater, in the Tuscan dialect, and encouraged the translation of the classics into this dialect for discussion, opening participation to a wider audience. This was certainly not lost on Piccolomini, who wholeheartedly bought into the translation movement. Indeed, the companion work to Della Stella Fisse, Della Sfera del Mondo, was essentially a rewriting of John de Sacrobosco's De Sfera. I say rewriting instead of translation because Piccolomini clearly did not do literal translations. Rather, Piccolomini would do a spiritual translation, in which he would cover the same topic loosely following the original, but perhaps explain things in a slightly different manner, or expand upon topics where he felt it necessary. Regardless, Piccolomini justified his support in translating classic works by arguing that those with excellent minds would be best served by being able to immediately engage with classics rather than having to waste what is left to them of their good years studying foreign languages. Another way in which the Accademia was surprisingly progressive is that it made a concerted effort to include women in their events known as degli. These events were essentially literary salons in which various works would be discussed and themes, history, and meaning explored. But in doing so, it was customary for the men to come up with a series of capricci as topics for discussion. Essentially, they would choose a theme, and a chosen woman would then discuss and develop it with their own knowledge. Men would then be expected to provide assistance to the women, offering suggestions, as well as providing embellishments or explanations for any obscure or confused statement. A master of ceremonies was even appointed to help give the spotlight to women who might otherwise be too shy to contribute. Certainly, there are some elements to this which we would today view as patronizing. Women were still expected to be brief in their statements, whereas men could speak at length. There's also some evidence that women speaking on such topics was considered something of a party trick, as Girolamo Bargali stated regarding these degli. I do not want a woman to have her say on every issue, but to speak only on those topics where she happens to be capable of saying some prettiness, and she should appear to do so because stimulated by the partner, rather than from a desire to speak or from the presumption of her knowledge of the subject. However, he also notes that a well-spoken woman of some age who had acquired some authority may be permitted to reason at length, contradict, and create paradoxes in the same manner as we have said with regard to men. In short, these degli provided a semi-informal forum in which women could access scholarly topics otherwise denied to them, with men serving as mentors until the woman was deemed to have reached her own intellectual maturity. And one of the women that had reached this status was the next important person to our story, as she was the one to whom Piccolomini dedicated Della Stella Fisse, Laudomia Forteguerri. Laudomia was born in 1515 to Alessandro di Nicodemo Forteguerri and Virginia di Gulli Pecci. Not much is known about her early life, but we do know that Laudomia was an accomplished poet. Out of her body of work, only 6 sonnets survive, and all are written to other women, mostly Margaret of Austria, the illegitimate daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. As such, Laudomia is still studied by scholars today for her sapphic themes. Her poetry certainly caught the attention of Piccolomini, and in 1541 he delivered an exploration of her poetry before another Accademia, the Accademia degli Infiammati. By this time, the two had certainly been acquainted for a number of years, as Della Stella Fisse was written in 1539 and published in 1540. Furthermore, Piccolomini wrote several sonnets in 1538 which were also believed to express a love for Laudomia, although he refers to her by the nickname Flori. There's an interesting poetic tribute to Laudomia by Giuseppe Bettusi, in which he describes an allegorical conversation between personifications of truth and fame, in which truth convinces fame to create a temple in which there are 12 statues. Each statue will represent a virtue and be depicted by a contemporary noblewoman. They will rest on a base which is a poet who has celebrated the woman in verse. Bettusi describes this base as the woman's conservatore, a curator or guardian. Laudomia is selected as one of the virtues, and Piccolomini as her conservatore. Truth asks whether such a woman even needs support, as illustrious as she is. Fame responds that she fears time, who will consume all. indicating that Piccolomini would ensure that the centuries will never erase their names. This explains the interconnectedness between the two, in which, without his recognition and support, her legacy would have been greatly diminished, and the texts he wrote for her ensured his own fame. The nature of their relationship has been the subject of much speculation to historians, but the actual evidence is largely one-sided and consists of the aforementioned sonnets from Piccolomini to Laudomia. Thus, there is some speculation that it was an unrequited love. Regardless of why, Piccolomini dedicated the companion works Della Sfera del Mondo and Della Stella Fisse to Laudomia, stating that she had lamented that she had not had the opportunity to nourish her spirit on astronomical subjects, towards which she felt more inclined than anything else. As such, Piccolomini produced these two astronomical texts meant to assist her with this interest. The second of these, Della Stella Fisse, is the one we'll now examine. The introduction to many of the works of this era are dedications to a patron. However, the introduction to Della Stella Fisse is somewhat different, as Piccolomini had already given the standard dedication to Laudomia in the previous companion work, Della Sfera del Mondo. Instead, Piccolomini begins with an unusual philosophical diatribe. It opens with a reference to Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary Hellenistic Hermetic philosopher. To be clear, Hermes Trismegistus was likely not a real person, but is the supposed author of a large body of pseudographic texts. In his work, Piccolomini makes reference to the Emerald Tablet, supposedly written by Hermes. He specifically references the portion often paraphrased with the well-known saying, "As above, so below." Here, Piccolomini cites Hermes, claiming that the number of images in the starry sky mirrors the number of types of mortal and transient beings. In short, the number of species is the same as the number of constellations. The choice of opening with Hermes may have been meant as a reference to something with which Laudomia may have had some passing familiarity, as the Siena Cathedral contains a series of mosaics on the floor, beginning with none other than Hermes Trismegistus. He continues stating that Hermes and the Pythagoreans argue that beyond a relationship between the number of constellations and species, that there is a finite number of individuals within a species. He then states that this number is given to either be 46,560,000 or 12,960,000. The first of these numbers, as best as historians can tell, comes from the 10th century astrologer Halley Abenragel in his Judica Astrorum. In it, Abenragel attributes the figure to Hermes and claims that this is the fixed number of souls, presumably of humans, upon the earth, as he says that when one person dies, another will be born, always maintaining the same number. The origin of the second is less certain, but is possibly related to a number referred to but not given explicitly in a commentary on Plato's Republic by Socrates. There, Socrates explains that republics inevitably tend towards tyranny, but that this can be ameliorated by maintaining the right number of people. Again, the number is not explicitly given, and the value of 12,960,000 is one of several that have been proposed as the specific value. In particular, the discussion of this number was popular among Neoplatonists during Piccolomini's time, which is where Piccolomini's reference to it allows him to offer commentary. And the commentary he immediately offers is a rejection of these previously stated ideas by telling the reader that not every species can have a corresponding constellation because some species may go extinct, whereas the heavens are eternal. For support of this, he cites Aristotle's Historia Animalium and Averroë's commentaries on Book 8 of Aristotle's Physics. Essentially, bringing up Hermes was an elaborate setup that demonstrated a local connection, allowed him to flex his broad knowledge, and establish himself as a proud Aristotelian thinker, as opposed to a Platonist. Next, Piccolomini states that the popular opinion is that there are only 1,022 stars. This number certainly comes from the star catalog in Ptolemy's Almagest. However, he again demonstrates that he knows more than common wisdom and recognizes that there are, in fact, more stars than this, but that astronomers only cataloged this number because it was all stars up to 6th magnitude, and that they had no concern for others because they were too difficult to observe and such faint stars could not hold any astrological significance. Piccolomini then tells us that these stars have been collected into 48 constellations, many of them named after various animals. He reiterates that this is not because they hold any special relationship to these species, but rather, they were placed there to bring fame to various heroes. He tells us that Cassiopeia and the winged horse are put in the sky for no other reason than to render eternal fame to Perseus with their form, and for no other reason does the lion appear than to make the virtue of Hercules live in perpetual memory. He then suggests that had the Roman Empire persisted, that they may have replaced the great constellations with their own mythologies. To that end, he points out the story of Julius Caesar being placed amongst the other stars in the sky after his death, referencing a great comet that appeared the same year Caesar was killed. Similarly, if Italy were to ever gain political dominion of the world and rewrite the constellations, that certainly Laudomia would be made one of them. He then closes out with a few paragraphs praising her before moving on to give an overview of the work itself. In this overview, Piccolomini states that his intent is to give the reader clear information about all of the 48 starry images on the 8th sphere, with the 8th sphere being the sphere of stars. This information includes the name of each one of these images, but also the reason for which they are so named, together with the fables from which they come. He promises that this information will be taken from most approved writers and the most famous poets. Furthermore, he promises to teach the reader how to find these constellations at every time of the year and whichever hour of the night you wish, as well as how many stars of greater or lesser magnitude are shining and adorn it. To do so, he tells us that he will go through each constellation individually, beginning with the North Celestial Pole. He will first provide the name of the constellations, the number of stars that compose the figure of the constellation, and the brightnesses according to Ptolemy. But the novel thing that Piccolomini tells us he has done is to illustrate the stars in each constellation to help make them easier to find in the sky. Each of these constellations, he says, are sized individually so that they fill the page appropriately, but that a scale will be provided to allow the user to understand their true size upon the sky. Lastly, he states that he will provide a table which will tell the reader where to look for the constellations at a given time in a given month. To assist with this, he advises the reader to use an instrument he described in De la Sfera del Mondo, which I will discuss in more detail later in this video. From there, he describes the order of the book, which is coincidentally the same as what he just laid out. But in this section, he provides examples of how to use each of these sections. I'll save that discussion until we're going through them. For each of these constellations, Piccolomini begins by presenting what myths are known regarding them. Here, the myths are presented at face value. Immediately following the myths behind Ursa Minor, Piccolomini explains why, telling readers that he does not intend to take the allegorical veil away from the fable in order to reveal historical facts and truth that is hidden beneath it. In other words, going beyond simply presenting these myths would distract from the purpose, as this was not intended to be a book on Greek history. Furthermore, he states that the true meaning behind these myths may well be lost to time. And, he tells us, this is the problem with myths, that their meaning can easily be lost and misunderstood. He then works in another dig at Plato, stating that Plato managed to obscure science by hiding it in fable. The myths themselves are largely taken from Hyginus's De Astronomia, so I won't dive into them too much here, as I plan to have a future series of videos looking into this work. Piccolomini's version is then supplemented by information from Giovanni Boccaccio's De Genealogia Deorum, although Piccolomini doesn't cite this source. The constellation of Equus is largely omitted from the discussion. While it does get an entry, Piccolomini notes that he has not read any fables of this that are worth narrating. Following the mythology, Piccolomini provides a list of stars that make up the figure of each constellation. For each, he gives a written description of where they are in the constellation and then lists the magnitude. By and large, the information here matches what Ptolemy provided in books 7 and 8 of the Almagest, although there are some notable differences. For example, the final list is much shorter than Ptolemy's list. There are two reasons for this. The first is because Piccolomini is only intending to describe the stars in the figure of the constellation itself. Ptolemy gives a more complete accounting of the stars, listing the stars in the vicinity of the constellation, but not making up the figure itself. Second, Piccolomini tells us that he only intends to include the brightest stars, up to 4th magnitude, although a handful of 5th magnitude stars are included, for two particularly faint constellations, Sagitta and Ara. Another discrepancy is that there are some interesting deviations between Piccolomini's descriptions of where the stars fall within the figure of the constellation and the ones provided by Ptolemy. In many cases, the differences in descriptions are trivial differences in language. But in the case of Orion, it is clear that Piccolomini envisions Orion quite differently than Ptolemy. Specifically, Ptolemy's description of Orion has him holding a pelt. Piccolomini describes this same set of stars as a shield, and historians are not sure where this came from, as none of the star catalogs of that era that we are aware of today contain any such description. Thus, the suspicion is that Piccolomini was making use of a pictographic source in addition. Indeed, we do find some illustrations of Orion armed with a shield in some depictions of the constellations. For example, some illustrations in the manuscripts from Hyginus's De Astronomia do indeed show Orion holding a shield. But these are exceptions, as most manuscripts show Orion holding a pelt, with his arm under his cloak, or holding nothing at all in his left hand. Similarly, in the constellation of Draco, Piccolomini describes the stars in the belly. Ptolemy doesn't describe any part of this constellation as a belly. But again, turning to the pictographic tradition, we do find cases in which Draco is depicted more akin to a wyvern than a snake, and does indeed have an area which could be described as a belly. In my video on the history of constellations, one that came up quite frequently was Libra, as during much of the later Greek era, there were two competing constellation traditions, one which included Libra and another which extended the claws of Scorpio to make use of the same stars. Interestingly, in Piccolomini's descriptions, we see remnants of both interpretations. The first two stars he describes in terms of the parts of the scales, but for the rest, he describes them as the claws. Surprisingly, maintaining these two traditions simultaneously was quite common in Piccolomini's era, and in many texts from around the same time, we find Scorpio's claws placed in the pans of the scales. As with before, Equus is only briefly mentioned, wherein Piccolomini notes that there are 4 stars on the head, but they are dim and not worth considering further. Before moving on, Piccolomini provides a list of the astrological symbols for the 12 signs of the zodiac, as well as the 7 planets. Obviously, in modern language, we would describe this as the 5 planets plus sun and moon. But to astronomers of the era, these were all considered planets as they moved with respect to the background stars. To introduce the star maps, Piccolomini first provides a key for the magnitudes of the stars, in which the brightest, first magnitude stars, are represented with an 8-pointed white star. Second magnitude stars are slightly smaller 8-pointed stars with alternating white and black rays. Third magnitude stars are again slightly smaller and represented by all black 6-pointed stars. Lastly, fourth magnitude stars are represented by yet smaller 6-pointed all black stars. The maps are each given a number corresponding to the entries in the previous section, but are also labeled with the names of the constellations for ease of use. The illustrations themselves are woodblock prints originally carved by the Volpini brothers, Giovanni and Domenico, in 1540 for the first printing of Della Stella Fisse. These same blocks continued to be used for many later editions, and they were evidently passed to other publishers that gained the rights to print the work. The woodblock prints were also clearly separate from the typesetting for the name and the number for each constellation, as some printings placed the wrong image on a given page. My copy here is certainly one of the affected versions. The depiction of Aquila is in the correct order, but has been switched with the header for Scorpio, the image for which has been switched with the Aquila header. Similarly, the image for Andromeda is in the correct place, but has been swapped with the header for Aquarius. Within the illustrations, the stars are labeled with letters, corresponding to their order in the previous list of stars, but there are some pronounced errors. For example, in Hercules, star F is entirely misplaced and should be much lower. The brightnesses of many stars is also inconsistent with what Piccolomini provided in the preceding section. In some cases, such as Sagitta, this may have been intentional, in which the brightest star, which is 4th magnitude, is represented by the symbol for a 3rd magnitude star, and the remaining, which are 5th magnitude stars, are represented by the symbol for a 4th magnitude star. In each image, the orientation of the image is denoted by the phrase parte verso il polo. Similarly, Piccolomini indicates the direction of motion across the sky with the phrases donde, whence, and verso dove, towards whence. But in almost all of the images, this logic seems confused. To understand why, let's consider Ursa Minor's depiction overlaid with an equatorial grid. In it, we can see the North Celestial Pole around which all stars rotate. As a quick note, the position for the pole is depicted in its position from 1540, whereas in the present day, it's much closer to star A, which we refer to as Polaris. In this view, the stars will rotate counterclockwise around the North Celestial Pole. Thus, the motion indicators make sense. Looking at the bottom ones, it moves from donde to verso dove, going left to right. And it also works for the top ones, where the motion above the celestial pole, still counterclockwise, becomes right to left. But this only works when the celestial pole is present within the frame of the image. If the pole is far outside the image, then the top set of motion indicators makes no sense. Each map also has a scale, given in degrees, to help readers interpret the size of the constellation. One interesting set of constellations is that of Ophiuchus and Serpens. This set presents an interesting challenge as Ophiuchus, a person, is intertwined with the serpent. To deal with this, Piccolomini separates the stars of the figure of Ophiuchus out in one image. Then, in a second, the stars of Serpens are shown, with a note in the middle of the image saying that this is the space of the figure encircled by the said Serpens. A map for Equus is excluded. Following the star maps, Piccolomini presents a series of tables for the constellations. Going through each of the previous constellations in the same order, he creates a row for each month, which is subdivided into 3 additional rows, one for each of the 3 brightest stars in the respective constellation. Then, he creates a column for the first 12 hours of the night. In each of these, he gives the position of the star, calculated for the kalends of that month, in what amounts to the altitude-azimuth coordinate system. I say amounts to because his way of giving the coordinates is not quite as straightforward. Rather, Piccolomini gives the angle of the star from the zenith, which is essentially 90 degrees minus the altitude. For the angle along the horizon, Piccolomini breaks the horizon into quadrants: Septentrionale Levante, northeast, abbreviated SL; Australia Levante, southeast, abbreviated AL; Australia Ponente, southwest, abbreviated SP; and Septentrionale Ponente, northwest, abbreviated SP. The angle he gives is either taken from north or south. Thus, in the northeast quadrant, the angle is directly equivalent to the azimuth. In the southeast, it is 180 degrees minus the azimuth, and in the southwest, it is the azimuth minus 180 degrees, and in the northwest, it is 360 degrees minus the azimuth. These 3 pieces of information are listed one above the other, with the top being the angle from the azimuth, the second being the angle from north or south, and the third being the abbreviation for the quadrant of the horizon. To make use of these tables, Piccolomini refers the reader to an instrument explained in the companion work De la Sfera del Mondo. Piccolomini briefly gives an overview of it in this text as well. In short, this instrument is a circle divided into 360 degrees, but displayed in the same manner as I just described for the horizon, in which north and south are 0, and the gradations increase to either side of it to a maximum of 90 degrees. The instrument has, on top of this, a rotating set of sights. For the purpose of finding these stars using the tables, Piccolomini instructs the user to build 2 of these instruments. One will be laid on a flat, level surface with the 0 points aligned with the meridian. Essentially, this represents the azimuth circle. The reader would first look up the position of the star's azimuth and align the pointer with this on the instrument. Next, the second instrument would be suspended above the line created by the sights and its dial adjusted to match the angle from the zenith. Then, if the reader looks through the sights of the second instrument, the stars should be visible within them. Obviously, there are several ways this can go wrong, and Piccolomini dedicates a section to this earlier in the book, cautioning the reader to avoid certain errors. His first reason is that the degrees presented in the tables are only given as whole numbers achieved by rounding. Thus, if the true value falls directly between the two, the user may be pointing by about half a degree off, which may be sufficient to cause the view to be obstructed depending on the narrowness of the sights. Second, the tables were calculated for the first day of each month. On any other day, the values would be different, and Piccolomini, quite understandably, does not provide such information, as the amount of additional calculations on his part would have been significant. Thus, Piccolomini instructs the reader to interpolate between the two, or, as he puts it, proceed using the proportional parts. Perhaps a surprising reason that he lists as a source of error is a bad clock. We often think of clocks as being a rather modern invention, but mechanical clocks developed in Europe in the early 14th century. These were still large instruments and were rather temperamental, but they certainly existed in Piccolomini's time. In fact, we see one being used in one of the illustrations in Tycho Brahe's Astronomy and Cetere Mechanica. Piccolomini gives the remaining sources of error as setting up the instruments incorrectly or taking too long to make an observation, in which time the stars would have moved. Interestingly, Piccolomini does not acknowledge the fact that the table is only calculated for each hour. Thus, the reader should also interpolate the values between the hours. In some cases, the star in question would be below the horizon, which Piccolomini denotes with the abbreviation sotto l'or, which is short for sotto l'horizon. Piccolomini also briefly outlines how the tables were calculated. Specifically, he states that he made use of certain pronouncements from a work by Peter Apian. Although he doesn't list the specific work, it is clear that he is referring to the Instrumentum Primi Mobilis, in which Apian describes an instrument used for calculating certain trig functions, and then provides a list of 100 pronouncements, which are astronomical algorithms for finding certain values. Modern scholars doubt Piccolomini's claims regarding his calculation methods, as these calculations are extremely time-intensive, and he claims to have only spent a small part of the summer composing the entirety of these two works. As such, it would have been much easier to use a celestial globe, on which the angles Piccolomini gives in the tables could have been directly measured. Although the globes we looked at in my previous video on constellations were all quite crude, those were from the 2nd century. By Piccolomini's time, accurate celestial globes were quite common and would have been readily available for this purpose. Regardless of how it was accomplished, reviews of the values given indicate that they are generally pretty accurate. The values indicate that they were calculated for a latitude of 42.5 degrees, which is slightly low, as Siena's true latitude is 43 1/3 degrees. This mistake aside, the values Piccolomini provides average a bit less than half a degree low for the zenith distance, with a standard deviation of a bit less than a degree and a half. For the azimuths, the average is only about a fifth of a degree low, but with a much higher standard deviation of a little over 3 degrees. This means that Piccolomini's claim that a reader using the instrument correctly would point precisely to the star in question are mostly false, but it would generally get the user close enough, given that the stars Piccolomini uses are the brightest stars in each constellation, and the reader could then refer back to the map to orient themselves further. As we would expect with such a large set of data, there are certainly some values that are in serious error. but it's hard to say exactly what the source of the error was, since Piccolomini's precise methods of derivation aren't certain. Even if he did perform the calculations he claims, one of the important values within it is to know the position of the sun on a given date. At the time Piccolomini wrote his work, there were several competing models, which all had slight variations, and we cannot be sure which one he used. As with before, Equus is skipped. In the final section of De la Stella Fisse, Piccolomini describes what part of the zodiac is rising, setting, or culminating at the same time as each of the constellations. Describing such simultaneous risings, settings, and culminations is part of a long tradition dating at least back to Aratus's phenomena. In his version, Piccolomini excludes two constellations, Ursa Minor because it never rises or sets at Piccolomini's latitude, and Equus because, as described previously, Piccolomini finds it to be unimportant. How these simultaneous risings and settings were calculated is not described, but historians again believe that a celestial lobe was likely used. A reason for this is that, in the entry for Canis Minor, Piccolomini states that the first portion of this constellation to set is the front feet, which sets at the same time as the 29th degree of Gemini. Canis Minor only has two stars in it, and Piccolomini describes neither of them as the feet. As such, it is likely that he used a globe which included illustrations of the figures of the constellations, which is what Piccolomini would have referred to. Similarly, for the setting of Hydra, Piccolomini describes the stars in the belly and mouth setting simultaneously. If these are the stars that Piccolomini described earlier in his catalog as being in the belly and mouth, then this statement would be an error. But if one looks at depictions, it is possible that a fourth magnitude star, which Piccolomini excluded from the catalog, is the one in the mouth to which he referred. De la Stella Fisse was a very successful publication. After its first printing in 1540, it saw 10 more editions printed within the next 30 years. The initial privilegio expired in 1552, and two publishers quickly took the opportunity to print pirate editions. Alessandro could renew the privilegio, but would need to make substantial changes and/or improvements. This led to a 1561 edition of De la Sfera del Mondo, which claimed that it was newly amended by him with many additions in various places and extensively enlarged. However, few changes had been made to the base text except to remove the dedication to Laudomia. The changes were mostly endnotes to the chapters and increased the total length by 1/3. It is suspected that this was largely padded to meet the conditions to get a new privilegio, as most of the editions were in books 1 and 2, and then changes quickly fell off once the goal was reached. Changes included adding some notes on astrology. Historians don't have a clear answer on why the dedication to Laudomia was removed, but it likely has something to do with a changing political climate. When it was first written, Siena was an independent republic. Since the 1520s, it had been weakened by internal conflict, which allowed the Spanish Emperor Charles V to take over. When the Sienese expelled the Spanish in 1552, Charles sent Gian Giacomo Medici to recapture the territory. Knowing that a siege was imminent, Laudomia led a group of 1,000 noble and artisan women to aid in construction of defenses. Unfortunately, Siena fell in 1555, after which point Laudomia's name no longer appears in the historical records. This change in leadership allowed the church to have more influence, and it viewed many of the liberal ideas expressed by the Accademia as heretical. Even prior to this, Piccolomini seems to have been shifting towards more conservative ideas, which can be traced to a series of changes made to another one of his works, Institutione, first published in 1542. While he maintained in the original version that women were inferior to men, by the second edition, printed in 1560, he stated that women should not be studying the sciences beyond a basic level. Rather, he says, a woman's place should be to establish a happy home as a sign of their love for their city. Similarly, Piccolomini attempts to ingratiate himself with the new leadership, writing to Cosimo del Medici and thanking him for the peace and stability that the conquest brought to Siena. If Laudomia was still alive, it is doubtful she and Piccolomini could have remained friends. Alessandro Piccolomini's Della Stella Fisse stands not only as a work of astronomical significance, but also as a reflection of the unique political and intellectual climate of Siena at the time. In this environment, women were notably allowed to participate in pseudo-academic salons, contributing to a distinctive blend of intellectual engagement and social inclusivity. These gatherings, conducted in the Tuscan dialect rather than the traditional Latin or Greek, reflected a broader movement towards accessibility in scholarly discourse, which is mirrored in Piccolomini's dedication to writing Della Stella Fisse in the vernacular. This choice allowed a wider audience to engage with the scientific ideas of the time, breaking down barriers between the elite and broader intellectual circles. Scientifically, Della Stella Fisse was quite novel. Unlike previous astronomical texts on the constellations, which primarily supplemented knowledge that readers would have likely gained from tutors, Piccolomini's guide sought to teach readers the constellations directly. By providing detailed descriptions and explanations of the stars in the sky, Della Stella Fisse became the first text to offer a comprehensive, hands-on guide to the constellations, emphasizing observation and practical learning. This novel approach laid important groundwork for the development of astronomical literature. It set the stage for later works, like John Bayer's Uranometria, which would refine and expand upon the task of mapping and cataloging the stars with greater precision. Piccolomini's work, while not as systematic as Bayer's, nonetheless represented a crucial step in the evolution of the celestial imagination.